Cary Grant watched Audrey Hepburn's funeral on television, and he wept alone. No cameras caught him. No reporters quoted him. The man who had charmed every audience he ever stood before chose silence and solitude on one of the hardest days of his life, and that choice reveals more about who he actually was than 3 decades of interviews ever could. The year 1963 brought them together on the set of Charade, a romantic thriller filmed largely in Paris that would go on to become one of the most beloved Hollywood comedies of that era. On screen, the pairing worked because what the audience was watching was real. Cary's timing, that dry and meticulous wit he had been refining since the early 1930s, met Audrey's warmth and intelligence at exactly the right angle, and the result was the kind of chemistry that directors can recognize but never manufacture. Something between them clicked, and the audiences who packed theaters to see Charade were responding to something that had nothing to do with the script and everything to do with two people who had genuinely found each other interesting. What nobody anticipated was that the friendship forming between takes and after wrap would outlast the film by 30 years. Audrey Hepburn had grown up in the Netherlands during World War II, living under German occupation as a child in a way that permanently shaped her understanding of what actually mattered. That experience, along with the hunger and hardship that came with it, had given her a precise and almost unforgiving ability to detect authenticity in other people. She extended genuine trust to very few, and the fact that she extended it to Cary Grant meant something because she did not give that kind of trust by accident or by charm alone. He was 26 years her senior, and the age gap might as well not have existed. What they shared was a quality of company that neither of them could easily find with other people. A mutual recognition between two individuals who had both spent long careers inside the film industry's social machinery while privately keeping their actual selves completely separate from it. Audrey was beloved globally for her elegance, her warmth, and her decades of humanitarian work with UNICEF, and yet the woman behind the public image was selective and careful about who she really let close. Cary was one of the most photographed and written about actors in the history of cinema, and yet the people who had known him longest agreed that almost no one had actually known him. Together, they gave each other something that most people in their world never found, a genuine friendship that required no performance from either of them. The bond continued long after Charade finished shooting. Letters traveled between them across years and continents. Occasional visits, arranged without publicists or press releases, kept the connection alive across the decades. Private phone calls that no journalist ever had access to maintained a thread of closeness that the entertainment press simply could not reach. Colleagues who witnessed them together in those years described the same dynamic every time, an ease and a naturalness between them that felt built up slowly over time rather than performed for any external benefit, because that is exactly what it was. Cary Grant's life outside of the frame that cinema had built around him was a complicated one. 5 marriages had come and gone, each with its own private wreckage, and through each of them he had kept the same precise control over his public image that made him so effective on screen and so genuinely unknowable off it. The biographers who spent years trying to map his interior life consistently arrived at the same conclusion. The emotional depth was real and often intense, but it belonged to him alone. He processed difficulty in private, by instinct and by preference, not because he lacked the capacity for feeling, but because he had more of it than he ever intended to share. Displays of vulnerability in public felt to him like a kind of theft, an invitation for strangers to take something that was not theirs. That disposition is the whole key to understanding what happened when Audrey Hepburn died. She had been fighting appendiceal cancer in the months before her death, and those closest to her had watched her declining through the final weeks of 1992. When she passed away on January 20th, 1993, at the age of 63, the response was global and immediate. Her film career alone, Roman Holiday, Sabrina, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Charade, My Fair Lady, had placed her permanently in the first rank of cinema's history, the kind of actress whose face and voice people carry with them for the rest of their lives. But her 3 decades as a UNICEF Goodwill ambassador had taken her legacy somewhere that most actors' careers never reach. She had traveled to the worst affected regions of Ethiopia and Somalia, to Sudan and Bangladesh, lending her visibility to causes that desperately needed it, and the world recognized on the day she died that it had lost someone whose value extended far beyond entertainment into something harder to name but easier to feel. Her funeral drew together the people she had actually held close. Her sons were present. Her partner Robert Wolders stood among the mourners. Former husbands Mel Ferrer and Andrea Dotti both came. Fashion designer Hubert de Givenchy, who had been among her most devoted friends for nearly 40 years, was there in a way that spoke to the depth of that particular bond. Actors Alain Delon and Roger Moore attended, as did representatives from UNICEF, whose work she had elevated so substantially. The gathering was small and felt genuine, which fit exactly who she had always been. someone who valued real connection over spectacle. Cary Grant's name appeared on no attendance list. His absence surfaced quickly in the coverage, and it generated the kind of speculation that tends to fill the space around something people don't understand. Some interpreted it as indifference. Others guessed the friendship had simply faded as old Hollywood friendships often do. Neither reading survived any actual scrutiny. The people who had known Cary for decades did not need him to explain himself because they already understood. Attending that service would have required him to do the one thing he had spent his entire life refusing to do: grieve visibly in public, in front of cameras that would record and distribute every expression for an audience that had no claim on his private life whatsoever. Reporters would have been waiting outside the church. Cameras would have followed him from arrival to departure. His face, his posture, the moment his composure cracked even slightly, all of it would have become the story, analyzed and reprinted and commented on by people who had no relationship with either him or Audrey, consumed by audiences who had no real understanding of what that friendship had actually been across 30 years of quiet maintenance. Cary Grant had held the boundary between his public face and his private life for 60 years of career. He was not going to dissolve it on the hardest day of that life, and that was not weakness or detachment. It was exactly who he had always been. He stayed home and watched the funeral broadcast on television. The people who were with him that day described the same scene: a man visibly undone, quietly weeping through the service, in a state of grief that was complete and private and entirely consistent with everything he had ever been. That image carries a weight that no press photograph could have captured, because what it shows is unfiltered. Cary Grant, alone in front of a television screen, crying for a friend he had trusted and valued for 30 years, in a room where no one would write about it and no one would publish it and no one would turn it into a tribute segment on the evening news. The friendship they had built was always like this. It operated in the space between public events, in letters and calls and visits that generated nothing for the entertainment press to work with. They had found in each other a quality of company that required no audience and no documentation. And when the friendship ended with her death, he honored it in exactly the register in which he had always kept it. Privately, completely. Without asking anyone to witness it, or acknowledge it, or attach a meaning to it that he hadn't chosen himself. Grief does not need an audience to be total. Some of the most complete losses a person carries never become public knowledge, and the people who carry them in full, regardless of whether anyone is watching. On the day the world gathered to say goodbye to Audrey Hepburn publicly, Cary Grant said goodbye privately, alone, in tears, in a way that was entirely his own. 30 years of friendship, honored without fanfare, without statement, without any gesture designed for external consumption. Just the loss itself, carried the way he had always carried the things that mattered most, quietly, fully, and away from every camera that had ever tried to find him. That is what the absence meant. Not coldness, not distance, not a fading of something that was once close. It was the opposite of all of those things. It was a man who felt the loss so completely that the only honest response available to him was to stay away from the performance of it and sit alone with the real thing, the way he had always handled what was real and the way he and Audrey had always understood each other, without requiring any of it to be seen.